Okay, my friends, it is Wednesday, April 16th, 2025. I have six big stories for today. So it seems like Russia is doubling down on maximalist objectives and maximalist demands, even though their economy, I showed you this yesterday, it's in the toilet. Long term, the health of the Russian economy isn't going to be good, but they're holding on to this. Let's go through the stories. We'll start with this, and I've been trying to show it for a couple of days. Newsweek reported that over the course of 18 months, North Korea sent Russia more than 15,800 containers of ammunition. Analysts identified at least 64 shipments from North Korea to Russia between August 2023 and March 2025, providing the Russian army with approximately 4.2 to 5.8 million units of ammunition. Another article was talking about how they got half of their artillery from North Korea. So would Russia, and they're creating their own, but would Russia be able to continue this fight without North Korea's ammunition? It's probably not a good sign. Okay. Next, yesterday yesterday in the last 3 days now, it is Wednesday. This happened on Sunday. We're talking about the footage from a church, the Sunday Sumy missile strike. This is what was happening, and listen to this. Yeah. How do you like to be in church and hear a missile go off just outside the building? And that's something, right? That's where they are. And there was no civilian, or there was no military thing. It was just civilian. Yesterday, I was talking about how there was a second strike, or this morning I was talking about a second strike. Yesterday, I was talking about a first reprisal against artillery brigade for what happened in Sumy. But there was no actual reason, like military reason, and yet the Trump administration wouldn't condemn Sunni's Palm Sunday massacre. The U.S. told G7 allies it won't back a statement condemning Russia's deadliest attack on Ukraine this year because it doesn't want to upset ongoing talks with Moscow. Now, while we're at that, this is what was carried in Russian media. The Russian army carried out a missile attack on the place where the commanders of the Ukrainian armed forces gathered in the city of Sumy on Sunday. 60 Ukrainian soldiers died. No such thing happened. Only civilians were targeted. And yet, the United States won't back this because they're in process of negotiations. You got to call evil evil at a certain point. And then it got worse. Lavrov said that the strike hit a site where Ukrainian officers met with NATO personnel. They were coordinating operations. Again, if that was true, show the proof. Oh, well, it's a conspiracy. Everyone knows NATO troops are directly involved in giving orders, he says. And they just make this up out of whole cloth. And yet this is who we're dealing with. So they're just going to keep lying and pushing the envelope as far as they can. This is Anton Gerashenko saying peace is impossible without Ukraine recognizing Russia's current territorial borders, according to Sergei Narishkin. He's the director of Russian Foreign Intelligence Service. He said, quote, the terms of the peace agreement clearly include the non-nuclear and neutral status of Ukraine. Neutral status means no NATO. The demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. Demilitarization means you can't fight when we come back again, and denazification means I'm not exactly sure what, because there's not Nazis there to begin with. I think it means just removing the current administration, and thus the abolition of all discriminatory laws that were adopted after the coup d'etat, which didn't actually happen in 2014. The president ran away and went to Russia. And of course, the recognition of sovereignty and current territorial borders of the Russian Federation. Okay, that's his demands. And then we heard, as a reply to that sort of thing about, what NATO is, President Duda of Poland said this: Russia, which is relocating its nuclear weapons to Belarus, brazenly bringing it closer to the borders of NATO and the European Union. Russia, which is behaving aggressively toward NATO and implementing its brutal and bloodthirsty imperialism, attacking Ukraine for 3 years. And that's the same Russia that's complaining about NATO is aggressive. Wait, you're moving your nukes closer to Poland by putting it in Belarus. You're doing this to Ukraine, but NATO isn't doing anything to anyone. Okay, at any rate. Okay, Institute for the Study of War. Ukraine must concede occupied Ukrainian territory and Novorossiya to Russia. Now, when they're talking about Novorossiya, what is Novorossiya? It looks an awful lot like a big chunk of what is Ukraine. And that's new Russia, and that should be what the Russians have, or that's the way that they're thinking about this. Okay, RT was talking about Russian control over liberated regions. Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson is the fastest way to a ceasefire in Ukraine. This is what Witkoff brought back after his meeting with Putin. And of course, I showed this the other day, and they said, after all, 99% in Donetsk, 98% in Luhansk, 93% in Zaporizhia, 87% in Kherson voted to join Russia from their fake voting election where they only control 70% of the land. Sure, yeah. Okay. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov reiterated Putin's rejection of Trump's proposal for a 30-day ceasefire. Still, he keeps poking him in the eye, and Trump's not doing anything about it. Meanwhile, Zelensky noted on April 14th that Ukraine has accepted the temporary ceasefire proposal over a month ago, but the Russians aren't doing it, and Trump weirdly isn't pushing back. And yeah, now Zelensky yesterday came out with his own red lines because what Witkoff was saying, well, the fastest way, the easiest way to peace is just to give Russia these 4 territories. Okay. Zelensky said this, only the people of Ukraine can decide on our territory. Zelensky gave this firm rebuke of Trump's envoy, clear message to Witkoff, who's been openly floating a settlement on 5 regions. Here it is. These are the red lines for us. Trump's Representative Witkoff is discussing matters beyond his competence. And here's what Zelensky actually said. Great Terry carried the translation here.
Here's the video.
For the territories, Ukraine is a sovereign state, and all territories belong to the unitary state of Ukraine. So again, only the Ukrainian people can decide about our state's territories. It's a red line for us to recognize any occupied territories as Russian, not Ukrainian. So again, those representatives you mentioned are discussing matters beyond their authority.
Yeah, so that's where we are. The Russians say we have to have all these territories. The Ukrainians say you can't have any of our territories, and that's where the peace negotiations actually are. Now, how is all of what's going on in the world, especially with the United States and Russia's relations, being carried in Russian newspapers? This is really interesting. One of the things that I look to is Steve Rosenberg reading the news. And this is good stuff. Listen to this, about a minute.
Today's Argumenty Fakty, this political scientist is delighted by the strained relations between the Trump administration and Europe over support for Ukraine. Soviet leaders' dream of driving a wedge between the European part of NATO and the United States has come true. Individual countries are ready to rebel against America. The Americans and the Russians are talking. This was President Trump's envoy Steve Witkoff with Vladimir Putin last Friday in Komsomolskaya Pravda. The Americans and the Ukrainians, well, Kommersant writes that relations between Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky, which seem to have improved a little, have once again descended into arguments and mutual insults. What is more, there is a paradoxical situation. Moscow and the US administration find themselves together in their standoff with Trump's opponents in America and in Europe.
This is so bizarre, the way this is working, especially when you consider what's actually happening. I showed this earlier. I just posted this a little less than an hour ago. Russia laughs at Trump's tariffs. How are they understanding what Trump has done to the U.S. economy and to the world economy? Okay. Now, by the way, this is what the economy looks like here. This was when the tariffs came out, and this is when the tariffs were repealed for a while, and it shot back up, but it's still not quite where it should be. And there was this really interesting comment by Michael Weiss saying, a Western intelligence official told me recently that the Russians cannot believe how fast and furiously the U.S. has pivoted toward Moscow, and that all this has led to a certain degree of conspiracism and paranoia among some factions of the Russian elite who sniff a trap. Now, I'm not the guy that's going to say that Putin is playing 3D chess or he's 7 moves ahead, or sorry, Trump is playing 3D chess or he's 7 moves ahead or anything along those lines. I'm not saying that, but he goes on and says, wouldn't it be grimly hilarious if Trump were also incompetent in his pursuit of rapprochement with Putin? Like if he did to his ceasefire arrangement with Putin, trying to help Putin, what he did to the economy, and again, what happened to the economy here has been absolutely devastating in the last 2 weeks. But yeah, meanwhile, here's what's going on with the economy in Russia. And again, yesterday I talked about this, how their economy is struggling in multiple ways. And you can go back to that video, my 3 big stories yesterday. But here are some more evidence of this. Another reason Putin must acquire as much of Europe as possible over the next 7 years or several years. China's oil production is now on target to match Russia's own decaying drilling system by 2030. So China's not going to need Russia in about 5 years or so. Already at 4.5 million barrels a day. That's what China's doing. So where is Russia going to sell its oil exactly? Okay, Gazprom, again, another indication of this kind of thing. Gazprom, JSC, plans to start producing washing machines and refrigerators in 2025. Well, isn't that good? No, they're forced to do this. In the United States, we're not forced to make our own stuff and just use our own stuff. We could outsource things that are cheaper and whatever, but they're forced to, and it's going to be more expensive because they're sanctioned as they are. But having lost almost 60% of exports after the gas war with Europe and not having received new contract with China, Gazprom has decided to start producing household appliances for Russians. And they're going to be more expensive and they're going to have lower quality. And that's what happens. Every economist will look at this and go, you know what, this is going to be bad comparatively to what they could have done if they could have freely traded. Okay, and more bad news here. This isn't bad news, but part of what happened here is that like the U.S. seems to be the lifeline for the Russians, right? So Bloomberg says that the U.S. demands Ukraine return $100 billion in aid instead of $300 billion. So Trump was talking about $300 billion, they're ripping us off. Now they're talking about $100 billion. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said minerals deal could be signed as early as this week. According to him, both parties are very close to a final decision. But the last iteration of this, the U.S. put in that they wanted to have control of a Russian gas or oil pipeline going from Russia through Ukraine into these other countries. And wait a minute, then Russian oil is back going on again, fueling the next war machine. And it's really bizarre, the things that keep getting into these contracts. The U.S. softens demand on Ukraine for resource deal, but maintains strict conditions, says Bloomberg. Key points: Trump administration reduced aid estimate from $300 billion to $100 billion. Deal still aims to recover aid through fund profits. U.S. insists wartime expenses count as contribution to the fund. But at least we're talking about $100 billion, which is actually close to the number, if you're talking about real aid to Ukraine. Okay, let's switch gears and talk about what's going on in Europe, because there's some weird things going on there too. Serbia's path to EU will be blocked if President Vučić attends Russia's May 9th parade, EU officials told The Telegraph. So what's happening here? So Serbia's president asked about Serbia's regime leader Vučić, who plans to travel to the Kremlin on May 9th for the big May 9th parade. I don't know what tanks they're going to have on the May 9th parade, but it'll be interesting to see what the difference is. I'm sure somebody will calculate the number of tanks in 2021 and then compare it to this year. With Fico and Orban, Kaja Kallas said that the EU will not stand by and watch a trip to Moscow without comment or action. So Serbia's EU path must be stopped if he's doing this kind of thing. We don't want another Hungary or Slovakia in the EU. Now, Fico was reacting to this. I'm going to Moscow on May 9th. Ms. Kallas, I would like to inform you that I am the legitimate prime minister of Slovakia, a sovereign state. He is. That's true. He can go where he wants, but it's just bad form to be doing this when your next door neighbor here is being under attack from the Russians. No one can tell me where I should or should not travel. I will go to Moscow. He has the right. I just think it's a bad idea. But he says this as well. No one can dictate to me where I can or cannot travel. I will go to Moscow to pay tribute to the thousands of Red Army soldiers who died liberating Slovakia, as well as to the millions of other victims of Nazi terror. That's what he says, Slovak PM Fico, in response to remarks by EU High Representative Kallas. But I remind you that that was in 1940s, early 1940s up through 1945, right? But this was 1968. The Soviet army rolled over what was Czechoslovakia. You got to remember that. That's part of the context here, and he seems to be forgetting about it. All right, well, I'll leave you with this by Darth Putin. Peace can be achieved just as soon as Ukraine can't defend itself from our next invasion. All right, that's all that I have for you, my friends, today. Thank you for your time, the likes, the shares, the subscribes. Thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.